fellow creators and viewers. My name is Miss Mbane. I am from Achivelile High School. Welcome to the Eastern Cape Department of Education broadcast studio. Today's lesson is about inflation. I will be covering this topic for your full understanding. Now remember, inflation is part of contemporary economic issues, which is assessed in your paper 2. I want us to look at the objectives of this lesson. At the end of this lesson, you learners will be able to briefly describe the concept of inflation, examine the ways to measure inflation, and explain the different types of inflation. You will be able to differentiate between consumer price index and the producer price index, as well as explaining the causes of demand pull and the causes of cost push inflation. You will also briefly discuss the consequences of inflation and briefly outline the expectancy and inflation. You will also briefly discuss measures to combat inflation, as well as explain inflation targeting and its success. I want us to also look at the common errors that are identified in this topic. General types of inflation, such as your hyperinflation, stagflation, demand pull, cost push inflation, are often listed by learners instead of consumer specific type inflation, such as headline core inflation and administered inflation, when they are asked to explain consumer inflation. The impact of inflation on taxpayers is also confused with the concept of progressive taxation, rather than addressing effects such as reduced real income or the bracket creep. The definition of stagflations are frequently incomplete, therefore lacking the link between high inflation, negative economic growth, and unemployment. Another error is that natural disasters are described in terms of their physical damage. There is no connecting them to rising production costs and therefore resulting to cost push inflation. Let's briefly describe the concept of inflation. Inflation refers to a sustained, continuous, and significant increase in the general price levels. This here means that inflation is a process. It is not a once-off rise in prices, but rather a continuous process in which prices are increasing from month to month or from year to year. Also, inflation is a considerable, it is concerned with a considerable increase in prices. Therefore, an increase of 1% or 2% per year are questionable whether to be described as inflation. Inflation also referred to an increase in the prices in general. Therefore, an increase in the price of a particular good or an increase in one or two goods is not described as inflation. There is inflation when prices of most goods in the economy are increasing. Okay, we said that inflation causes a decline in the purchasing power. If we can see from the image here, we can see over the past 10 years, the prices have been declining due to inflation. Therefore, inflation decreases the purchasing power of money, making people to purchase less goods. People can no longer afford the same goods and services with the same income. If we look at the picture here, we can see that in 2015 the basket is full. It has more. It had more goods. We can see that because money had still value. And in 2020 the basket now has fewer items, as we can see, because prices have gone up. Also, we can see that in 2025, now the basket is nearly empty. This is due to what? This is due to money losing its value because of price increases. Now let us look at the different types of inflation. The different types of inflation are the headline inflation, which refers to unadjusted CPI, consists of a shopping basket of goods and services of an ordinary South African household in urban areas. It is used by SARB to monitor inflation. The headline inflation now includes volatile items, those items that continually increase, such as food and fuel. The core inflation then excludes those items that have high volatile prices, that is those that changes quickly and often, and those that are affected by government intervention. Examples of those items are vegetables, fresh and frozen meat, and as well as fuel. Core inflation, remember that it is usually lower than headline inflation and it is stable. The reason for that is that core inflation excludes those items that continuously change, those items that change all the time. Then we have administered inflation. Administered inflation are those prices that are controlled or set by government through authorities such as electricity, that is regulated by NESA. I've also included here a picture which shows the basket of goods and also which shows headline inflation and core inflation. From the image here, we can see that headline inflation does include all those items, which is the housing, transportation, medical, electronics, food, and energy, whereas the core inflation only include these items and exclude food and energy. Remember that these are volatile, these causes prices to change quickly and often. Now we look at other types of inflation. We have producer price index, which measures the prices of domestically produced goods. All-inclusive inflation measures the changes in the prices for all final goods and services, not only those that are in the selected basket. Okay, then we also have hyperinflation when there is an extremely high and rapid increase in the general price level, inflation rate of above 50% or higher per month. It is also known as the runaway inflation. Remember that it once occurred in Zimbabwe, where prices were increasing very fast, that money became almost worthless. Okay, when there is hyperinflation, people lose confidence in the value of money and may resort to barter trade. Another type of inflation is stagflation. When a country experiences a situation of there is low economic growth, high unemployment, and high inflation at the same time. It is known as stagflation. This type of inflation is very difficult to fix, as we can see, because when there is high inflation, in order to decrease high inflation, the South African Reserve Bank has to slow down the economy. So if the economy is already weak, that makes unemployment to worsen. Now, this is a very difficult type of inflation, because remember, when there is high inflation, in order to decrease inflation, the South African Reserve Bank has to slow down the economy. So if the economy is already weak, it makes unemployment to worsen. Okay, now we look at the comparison between CPI and the producer price index. Okay, consumer price index pertains the cost of living, as it measures goods and services that are bought by consumers. When we compare it, producer price index, it pertains the cost of production. The basket consists of consumer goods and services. In the PPI, the basket consists of goods only. Capital and intermediate goods are excluded in the CPI. Remember that consumers spend more on final goods. Capital and intermediate goods are included in the producer price index as they are used in the cost of in the production. Prices include VAT. Interest rates are considered in the CPI. Prices exclude VAT. Interest rates are also excluded in the PPI. Okay, I've also included an activity that you can use to test your understanding, basically on what we've already covered. So this activity will describe the concept of inflation, core inflation, headline inflation, all-inclusive inflation, and stagflation. Okay, I want you to write this activity and also include it in the comment section. Try to test your understanding and see if you have understood what we have covered already. The main causes of inflation are demand pull and cost push inflation. The concept of demand pull occurs when total demand increases faster than total supply. Says that it is when too much money is chasing too few goods. The demand then pulls up the prices. Okay, what causes the demand pull inflation? Demand pull inflation is caused by an increase in the consumption spending by household as a result of decline in savings. So if consumers' savings habit changes and decide to spend more, that may cause aggregate demand to increase faster than aggregate supply, therefore causing inflation. Another thing is that when tax rates are reduced, for instance, when income tax reduced, consumers now have more disposable income and they may demand more goods and services, spending increases, that leads to demand pull inflation. Easy access to credit. Now, cheaper credit due to lower interest rate may stimulate spending and therefore causing demand pull inflation. Okay, demand pull inflation is also caused by increase in investors' expenditure, which means that lower interest rate may result in the improvement in the sentiments and profit expectations of businesses. So if businesses invest more, it may lead to an increase in the demand for goods and services that are part of their investment. Remember that in investment expenditure is an injection. So increase also in government expenditure. An increase in government expenditure to improve services and create jobs without a corresponding increase in demand and supply may lead to increases in the prices, because an increase in government expenditure has an effect on job creation. Another factor that causes demand pull inflation is an increase in export services. So the sale of exports brings money into the country. So if the demand increases without a corresponding increase in supply, it may result into price increases. We also look at the cost push inflation as the cause of inflation. Cost push inflation is caused by an increase in the production cost, as such increases are passed on to consumers. It is also described as an increase in the cost of goods that are important to the economy, of which no alternative exists. For instance, we're talking about oil prices. Now we look at the causes of cost push inflation. It is caused by increase in wages. An excessive demand for wages or salaries by trade unions can cause an increase in factor cost. Remember that increases in wages will lead to an increase in labor cost, and labor is a factor of production. Therefore, an increase in wages could lead to increase in factor cost. Therefore, to stay profitable, businesses may increase prices in order to recover those costs. Expensive key inputs. Key inputs are essential raw materials that businesses need to produce goods and services. These are oil prices, fuel, electricity. So when the prices of these key inputs increases, these key inputs that are imported increases, this leads to domestic production to go up. Producers then are forced to pass these increases to consumers in the form of higher prices. Then now we also look at exchange rate depreciation. So if the rand weakens against the dollar or loses its value, all imported goods and services become more expensive. This affects the prices of all goods and services. Remember that most of capital goods are imported. So businesses may pass these higher costs on consumers by increasing the prices of goods and services. Now we also look at the increase in profit margins. So when businesses push up their profits, when they want higher profits, they may increase the cost of production, and these are passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Also, lower productivity. If productivity decreases but remuneration stays the same, what happens is that the cost per unit will increase, which will lead to total cost of businesses increasing, and these may be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Then we also have natural disasters. Natural disasters. How do natural disasters cause inflation? Natural disasters such as floods, drought, do create cost push inflation due to the shortages they cause, especially in the food industries. So when there is natural disasters such as those floods, they may limit or reduce the supply of goods and services, leading to higher prices, and this will be passed on to consumers. Now we look at the consequences of inflation. We want to look at how inflation impacts on the different role players in the economy. Inflation does result into winners and losers. Let's see how these role players in the economy are affected by inflation. During inflation, creditors, which are lenders, they suffer due to price increases because they get money back, which has a lower purchasing power. Inflation harms creditors as they lose due to the decrease in the purchasing power of money. Debtors, which are borrowers, they receive money with a high purchasing power and they repay the loans with a low purchasing power. So debtors benefit during inflation because the contracts were signed in advance and cannot be changed. Wage and salary earners. Inflation affects people whose income does not increase at the same rate as inflation. These people are pensioners, retired people, and those that earn a low income are affected highly as price increases because their almost fixed salaries purchases less goods than before. Investors and savers. How investors and savers are affected by inflation. Investors, assets with a fixed nominal value have a fixed return and a lower purchasing power as price increases. This means that these people, the savers, are negatively affected by inflation as their returns do not grow as inflation increases. Investors in assets with a flexible market value. It says that assets with flexible market value increases more rapidly than increases in the general price level. This means that investors in property and shares are favored by inflation, as we have seen that because that they get the increases that are more than the increase in the general price levels. Taxpayers, how are taxpayers affected by inflation? Okay, so remember that South Africa uses a progressive taxation system, which means that the high income earners are taxed at a higher rate, low income earners are taxed at a lower rate. So with inflation, taxpayers' nominal income rise, that is, it increases, although their real income remains unchanged. Why? Because taxes are levied or charged on nominal income and not on real income. Therefore, this affects the purchasing power of taxpayers. Taxpayers now experience what we call a bracket creep resulting from inflation and progressive taxation. All right, bracket creep, it is when inflation pushes taxpayers into a higher tax bracket, even though their real purchasing power has not increased. Industrial peace. So inflation disturbs industrial peace. How? Because high inflation says that it disturbs industrial peace and makes consumers to demand higher wages. The wage bargaining is often accompanied by strikes, mass actions, which can be disruptive and sometimes spill over into violence. So if we can see from the image that we have here, remember that when workers are bargaining for higher wages due to a decline in their purchasing power, it means that the employers will be left with no choice but to agree with them. And when the wages increases, it means that labor cost will also increase, and that will result into cost push inflation. Now, when there is inflation, these will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Let us now look at measures to combat inflation. What can we do to curb this inflation? What can we do? What can the South African government and the Reserve Bank do to combat this inflation, demand pull, and cost push inflation? We'll look at the monetary policy measures. So monetary policy is the use of monetary policy measures by the South African Reserve Bank to curb or to combat inflation. So they can increase the repo rate, which can lead to commercial bank increasing their prime interest rate at which they loan money to their clients. Now, it means that if there is higher interest rate, consumers will be discouraged to take loans, and then spending will decrease, which will help to combat demand pull inflation. The South African Reserve Bank can also decrease money supply by selling government bonds or securities in open markets. So when they do that, SARB sells securities to banks, money flows out of the banking system to the South African Reserve Bank. Banks are left with little money to lend to consumers, and that can discourage spending. So when SARB sell government bonds or securities, money flows out of the banks to SARB. Banks are left with little money to lend to consumers. This may discourage spending and therefore limit inflation or reduce inflation. Monetary authorities can reduce the level of credit by instructing banks to apply stricter credit lending criteria. Inflation will be reduced because credit will be granted to fewer customers. This is moral suasion, whereby now the SARB talks to banks to act in a manner that is desirable for economic conditions at that time. SARB instructs banks to be stricter when giving credit to consumers so that spending decreases and that demand pull inflation will be reduced. Commercial banks can be required to keep a larger amount of money in reserves. This is cash reserve requirement. The SARB will require bank to keep a large amount of cash reserves. This amount of money that banks give out as credit will help to curb inflation. So if the cash reserve requirements of banks are increased, it means that they are going to keep large amount of money. So now we look at the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy are the steps that are taken by the Minister of Finance to control inflation through the application of taxes and government spending. So a restrictive fiscal policy involves a reduction in government spending, that is decreasing government spending and increasing taxes. All right, so this can reduce inflation as the demand of goods and services will be reduced. Remember now, an increase in taxes means that consumers are left with little disposable income to spend. Okay, so government can also increase direct taxation such as income tax, business tax, and as well as to decrease the demand for goods and services. All right, as we said that consumers will be left with little disposable income in order to spend, therefore that decreases the demand for goods and services. Then also an increase in indirect tax such as VAT, custom duties, excise duties also causes spending to decrease because now goods will be expensive. So consumer demand and spending will also decrease. Government can also reduce its spending on public goods and welfare payment. The state also cuts back on its expenditure by postponing or even cancelling government projects, which we said that these projects have an impact on job creation. So now if these projects are cut or these projects are cancelled, it means that the demand for goods and services will decrease as people have no jobs, and also as consumer spending decreases. Then aggregate demand will decrease, therefore reducing total demand. Remember that these measures that are applicable to reduce total demand in the economy, therefore reducing demand pull inflation. Other measures to reduce inflation which are applicable to cost push inflation are implementing a wage policy where wage increases are kept in line with inflation rate. The government can also increase productivity by investing in technology through better education and training to reduce the cost of production. So when productivity increases, it means that the cost of production will be reduced. The government can also encourage personal savings, which will enable investment and supply. Also, reducing import controls will make imported goods cheaper, therefore relaxing import controls to supplement local production in order to avoid shortages. Because remember, when there is a decrease in the supply of goods and services, price increases, and also promoting competition domestically and from abroad, which helps to control high profit margins by the businesses. The government can also improve efficiency of infrastructural services such as energy and transport to reduce the cost of doing business in the economy, therefore lowering prices. The government also provides subsidies to producers of certain goods in order to reduce their cost of production. The government can also promote small business development to increase competition in the market. An increase in competition will lead to an increase in the supply of goods and services, as there are more businesses. The government can reduce taxes that are paid by businesses in order to reduce the overall cost of production, which will allow the businesses to produce more output. Here is another activity that we have included. In this activity, you will be answering the following questions. Describe the concept that we just explained: the demand pull, cost push, administered price inflation. Also, answer how do the actions of trade unions cause inflation, and how is reduction in taxes linked to demand pull inflation. You may also write your answers in the comments. Now we move to expectations and inflation. During periods of inflation, consumers expect prices to rise. They often buy more goods and services before their expected prices increases, thereby adding to aggregate demand. It says that when consumers expect prices to increase, they often buy more goods before their prices to rise, therefore causing more inflation. So we've seen from the image which shows wage bargaining in South Africa by trade unions and workers. So when workers bargain for higher wages due to the decline or decrease in their purchasing power, it leads to increases in labor cost, and these costs will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Okay, increase in labor cost increases production costs, which are passed to consumer in the form of higher prices. The expectations that wages will rise encourages some businesses to increase prices in advance. The expectation that wages will rise encourages businesses to increase prices in advance. Okay, the higher the expected inflation rate, the higher the level of wages and prices will be. All right, now we look at inflation targeting in South Africa. Inflation targeting is the most effective policy tool that can be used to break the inflationary expectation, which causes continuation of inflation. So South Africa formally introduced inflation targeting in February 2000. Inflation targeting in South Africa is kept between 3 to 6%. So inflation targeting is a transparent way to explain interest rate policy and to manage consumer expectations about future inflation. All right, this certainty can stimulate economic activities. Businesses are able to make investment decisions knowing that prices will be stable. However, this policy is ineffective in dealing with cost push inflation, as the factors that cause cost push inflation are outside the control of monetary authorities. We have come to the end of our lesson. You can leave your questions on the comment. Don't forget to leave the name of your school so we can give shout outs. Please share and like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. See you on our next lesson.